The year was 1856, and the air in Westgate Hollow carried the scent of coal smoke and wet lavender. It was a small Yorkshire village stitched into the side of the moors, the kind of place where every chimney had a story and every doorstep a worn stone from generations of boots. In the heart of the village, behind a hedge of unruly hawthorn, stood the parsonage. It wasn't grand, nor was it humble. A 2-story house of soot-darkened brick and creaking timbers, it bore the lean of years and the hush of long prayers. The garden out front was wild in places, tamed in others, half obedience, half rebellion. A weathered sundial stood off-center in the lawn, forgotten most days by everyone except the crows. Inside the house, Miss Harriet Fenn awoke to the faint toll of the church bell. 6 slow chimes, muffled by distance, and a thick woolen blanket wrapped around her ears. She was 23 years old, daughter to Reverend Ambrose Fenn, and keeper of his household since her mother's passing 3 winters ago. Harriet's room faced east, and pale light now spilled through the warped window panes, silvering the dust on her bookshelf and softening the peeling green paint on the walls. She sat up slowly, conscious of the cold against her back. The fire had died in the grate during the night, leaving the air brittle. Her breath puffed visibly as she reached for her dressing gown, thick flannel patched under both arms. She didn't mind. It was her mother's once. Everything in the parsonage had once belonged to someone else. Harriet's feet found her slippers, and she padded across the uneven floorboards to her washstand. She poured water from the blue and white jug into the basin, teeth gritting as her hands met the icy splash. There was no luxury in this part of England, no idle indulgence. Not for parsons' daughters, not even in summer, certainly not in March. By the time she had twisted her hair into a knot and buttoned her gray day dress, the kettle had begun to hiss over the kitchen range. She descended the narrow stairs, pausing only to check on her younger brother Samuel, still asleep and tangled in his quilt. At 15, he was all elbows and dreams, and he stirred only faintly as she gently closed his door. The kitchen, dark-paneled and low-ceilinged, smelled of damp stone and rising yeast. Mrs. Gowling, their housekeeper of 10 years, was already there, stocky and red-cheeked, with hands like shovel blades and a habit of muttering Latin prayers while kneading dough. "You'll want your tea before the Reverend comes down," she said without looking up. "He's in one of his moods. Dreamt of his brother again." Harriet nodded. Her Uncle Edwin had been lost in the Crimea the year before, and her father's grief wore many masks. Some days he spoke of Edwin as though he still expected his return. Other days he recited whole passages from Corinthians with a strange glint in his eye. The tea was strong and dark. Harriet drank it standing near the window, gazing out at the frosty garden. A blackbird danced across the bare earth, pecking at frost-bitten worms. Beyond the hedge, she could just make out the church spire slicing through the fog. Breakfast was quiet. The Reverend Ambrose Fenn came down dressed immaculately, as ever, in his black frock coat and clerical collar. A copy of the Times folded under his arm. He murmured a prayer before eating, then tucked into a plate of eggs and smoked kippers. "The bishop writes of the poorhouse," he said between bites. "There's talk of closing the one in Lower Swindale, the inmates to be moved north." Harriet buttered a slice of toast. "Will we be expected to take any?" "God expects us to do what we can," her father replied flatly. "The parish will convene a meeting." She knew what that meant. Another week of sorting alms, baking extra loaves, and listening to the Widow Briers insist that paupers ought to be fed gruel and not a morsel more after breakfast. Harriet walked into the parlor with her sewing basket, only to find someone already there. A thin man in a tweed coat stood by the bookshelf, peering through wire-rimmed spectacles. He turned, startled, and offered a short bow. "My apologies," he said. "I'm Arthur Redwell, here about the schoolroom repairs." "Ah," said Harriet. "Yes, of course. You're early," he smiled faintly. "Better than being late, Miss Fenn." The schoolroom stood at the edge of the churchyard, a single stone building with a leaking roof and windows that rattled in every wind. Arthur had been hired to make repairs before the next term began. Harriet offered to show him the way. As they stepped outside, the chill clamped down like a shroud. "You're not from Westgate Hollow," she said, after a pause. "From Hull, originally," Arthur replied. "But I prefer the quiet of smaller places." Harriet glanced sideways. He didn't seem like a laborer to clean, too careful in his speech. His hands bore calluses. But his voice had the rhythm of someone who had once read poetry aloud for the joy of it. They reached the schoolroom, and he bent to examine the cracked sill and gaping eaves. "You've rats," he said calmly, "and frost's done worse damage than you think. This whole beam may need replacing." Harriet folded her arms, trying not to shiver. "We haven't the funds for much." Arthur stood. "Then I'll charge you only for the timber, and do the rest for bread and a warm fire." She looked at him. He wasn't smiling now, only earnest. And somehow that made her feel warmer than the hearth inside the parsonage. "Thank you, Mr. Redwell," she said. He nodded and tipped his cap. "I'll be back tomorrow with tools." And just like that, he was gone. Harriet turned back toward the churchyard, wind biting at her cheeks, unsure why her heart felt lighter than it had all winter. The next morning broke with the hush of a fog-bound sky, the moor beyond Westgate Hollow, entirely swallowed in soft white silence. The villagers went about their early chores, as wraiths, in the mist. Boots crunching softly on frost-hardened dirt, scarves pulled up to ears, and hats tugged low. Chimneys puffed their ghostly plumes and shutters creaked on their hinges as Westgate eased itself into another gray March day. Inside the parsonage, the morning light slid through Harriet's window in thin sheets, blurring the lines between shadow and fabric. She stirred before the bell from the church steeple rang, already half-dressed in thought, wondering if Arthur Redwell would return that day as promised. The thought unnerved her slightly, not in the way that danger unsettles, but in the quieter, more delicate way that unfamiliarity does, like stepping into cold water, knowing it won't harm you, but still gasping when it touches your skin. By the time she made her way downstairs, Samuel was already at the table, eating toast. He was flushed from sleep and hunched over a sketch of a horse drawn on the back of a sermon draft. "That's Father's," she said, plucking the paper gently from beneath his elbow. Samuel shrugged, grinning. "He never rereads them." Mrs. Gowling entered with a tray, steam curling up from the tea kettle. "No sign of the man yet," she said to Harriet. "The one with the spectacles." Harriet nodded, biting into a warm scone as her father descended the stairs with a groan. He moved slower these days, especially after a winter's worth of aches settled into his joints. Harriet suspected it wasn't just age, but grief that weighed him down. The Reverend Fenn sat without ceremony, unfolding the paper and staring at it for a long time without turning the page. "You remember Arthur Redwell, Father?" Harriet asked lightly. "The builder. He's returning today. The one from Hull," her father murmured. "Yes. He offered generous terms." Her father gave a slow nod. "We'll need men like him soon enough." The bishop's letter mentioned cuts to the society fund. Harriet stiffened slightly. That fund paid for everything, from orphans' boots to the schoolroom ink. Without it, more burdens would fall on their shoulders, and Mrs. Gowling was already rubbing her knees each night in silence. After breakfast, Harriet wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and headed to the schoolhouse with a small basket of oat biscuits tucked under one arm. Fog licked the stone paths and clung to the low stone walls. She passed Mrs. Pemberley the laundress, dragging a bucket full of steam across her threshold, and young Elsie Bennet on her way to deliver eggs to the widow Marsh. Everyone nodded politely. No one ever said much in the mornings. When Harriet reached the schoolhouse, she found Arthur already there. He was on the roof, or rather half on it, straddling a ladder with a hammer in one hand and a smile playing beneath his thick scarf. "You're early," she said, setting down the basket on the bench. He tapped a nail into place. "So are the rats." Harriet smiled despite herself. She stepped into the building and looked around. Dust floated in the beams of light, slipping through cracks in the shutters. The smell of old wood and chalk lingered in the air. A child's slate still leaned against the far desk, its last arithmetic lesson ghosted in chalk. Arthur joined her inside a few minutes later, wiping his hands on a rag. "May I offer you something?" Harriet asked, motioning to the basket. "Mrs. Gowling's oat biscuits. She adds lemon peel when the weather is grim." He sat on the bench and took one carefully. "Tell her she's a genius." They sat in silence for a while, each warming, slowly, to the comfort of the space. The world outside was hushed, as if listening. Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I took liberties last night," he said. "Sketched a possible repair for the windows." Harriet unfolded the page. His lines were neat, clear, labeled like an architect's plan. There was something dignified in the way he'd drawn, even. "The nails you studied?" she asked. He gave a small smile. "Briefly mechanical engineering in Leeds. I didn't take to it. Prefer buildings that creak." "Why?" "They speak more honestly than machines." Harriet nodded. Machines always want something. That made him laugh, and for a moment, the tension in the air eased. She spent the rest of the morning with him in the schoolhouse, sweeping corners, noting repairs, and discussing where to put the new rain barrels. Arthur worked steadily, occasionally humming a tune she didn't know. It was a pleasant kind of melody, not quite cheerful, but full of quiet purpose. By noon, Mrs. Gowling arrived with a wrapped parcel from the parsonage kitchen, and raised an eyebrow when she saw them working together. "Careful, Miss Fenn," she said in a stage whisper. "You'll be mistaken for one of the help." Harriet only smiled and handed her a list of items needed from the village shop. That afternoon, the church bell tolled again, not for time, but for death. Word came from the edge of the village. Mr. Temple, the old cooper, had passed in his sleep. No surprise. He'd been ill for weeks. But still, the village shifted, as it always did when one of its own left. The funeral would be held on Thursday. The Reverend would prepare a eulogy. Harriet would iron the mourning cloths. Samuel would ask too many questions, and no one would answer them well. Even Arthur paused, hat in hand, when he heard. "I met him once," he said. "Bought a stool off him in the summer. Said I didn't haggle enough." "That sounds like him," Harriet said softly. The fog thinned near evening, and the last light of day kissed the tops of the moors with a faint gold. Harriet stood by the parlor window again, watching the world lose its edges. Arthur had returned to the boarding house where he was staying with the Harts, and the parsonage settled into quiet. Her father had gone to his study, books open but untouched. Samuel was drawing again. Harriet sat with her sewing, but her fingers moved less purposefully than before. When she looked up, she found herself gazing into the fire, wondering how many other women had sat in this chair, thinking of someone who had spoken kindly to them across a workbench. She shook her head and resumed her stitching. Outside, the village bells tolled again. 80 single quotes. Another day folded quietly into the next. The sky deepened, the wind hushed, and the house settled into sleep, with only the softest creaks of timber and the sigh of wind through the eaves. The morning of Mr. Temple's funeral arrived with a cold drizzle that darkened the cobbled lanes and lent every surface the sheen of wet slate. Crows settled along the cemetery wall, their black eyes glinting in the mist. Westgate Hollow never looked more like its name than when cloaked in grey. Harriet Fenn stood in front of her wardrobe, holding up a strip of black crepe ribbon. She wasn't yet in full mourning. Mr. Temple had been no relation, but in a village like theirs, even the small rituals mattered. Respect was stitched into your collar, tied into your bonnet. Pinned at the throat, she fixed the ribbon just beneath her chin and turned from the mirror. Downstairs, Samuel was polishing the Reverend's boots with more vigor than precision. His brows furrowed. "Why do we wear black for the dead?" he asked without looking up. "To remind us they're gone," Harriet replied gently. "That doesn't make them come back." "No," she said, buttoning her gloves. "It just means we noticed they left." At 11, the village gathered in the stone nave of St. Iadon's. The pews were filled with shawls and dripping umbrellas, solemn faces and clasped hands. Harriet sat beside her father, listening as he read Psalm 90 in a voice rough with age and cold. "Teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." The bell tolled once more. Harriet felt it in her chest, after the burial. She lingered behind, nodding quietly to the Temple family, their grief worn tight as corset strings. She moved toward the churchyard's edge, where moss softened the headstones and time leaned heavily against crumbling stone. She was surprised. to find Arthur there. He stood with his hat in his hands, eyes on a weathered marker, half hidden in ivy. When he noticed her, he gave a short nod. "I didn't expect you here," she said. "I wanted to pay my respects," he replied. "Seemed right." She stepped closer. The grave he was looking at belonged to a child, Martha Elkins, aged 7. Died of scarlet fever, 1887. "My sister," he said softly. "She died when I was 12. "I'm sorry," Harriet said, surprised by the sudden intimacy. She used to draw stars on everything. Pages, walls, even the cat. Harriet smiled, trying to picture it. "That's a lovely sort of rebellion." They stood there in silence for a moment, the cold dampness seeping through their boots. "I'll be heading back to Hull on Saturday," Arthur said finally. She looked up, startled. So soon? He gave a one-shouldered shrug. "Work's done. Materials ordered. Repairs begin next month, once the snow's melted proper." Harriet nodded, unsure what to say. "I'll return, of course," he added, too quickly. "I promised to oversee the windows myself." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "We'll have your tea waiting." Arthur smiled. "It's not the tea I'll be looking forward to." They didn't speak of it again, not that day. Not even as they walked back down the lane together in the drizzle, past the greengrocer's window and the quiet sweep of the moor beyond. The silence between them felt filled, somehow not empty, but soft and waiting. Back at the parsonage, Samuel was complaining about the mud, and Mrs. Gowling was peeling turnips in a rhythm that suggested mild irritation. The Reverend had returned to his study. Exhausted by the eulogy, Harriet climbed the stairs and sat again by the parlor window, watching the village beyond blur through rain-specked glass. The forge let out a hiss of steam. Children in mourning. Coats kicked stones through puddles. And from the upper room of the Hart boarding house, she saw the flicker of Arthur's lamp. She didn't wave. He didn't look. But somehow she knew he'd seen her too. March waned slowly in Westgate Hollow. Rain gave way to sleet, and sleet to a wind so raw it peeled the warmth from your fingers the moment you stepped outside. The bare trees along the parsonage lane trembled with each gust, their thin limbs rattling like bones against the stone sky. Harriet Fenn kept herself busy. With Arthur Redwell gone back to Hull, the quiet of the village seemed deeper, as if a small warmth had been drawn from the hearth and taken with him. She didn't dwell on it not out loud, but she found herself glancing more often at the post, or pausing a little longer when passing the window. Mrs. Gowling noticed. Of course she did. "You've gone moony," she muttered over her knitting one evening, squinting at her needles. "Wool's not the only thing getting tangled lately." "I don't know what you mean," Harriet replied evenly. The older woman grunted. "I've lived through 3 wars and 2 courting scandals. You've got the same look my cousin had before she married the cooper from Whitby." "That's hardly evidence," Harriet said, though her cheeks warmed. "I'll start knitting lace, then," Mrs. Gowling said, with a smirk. "You can tell me I'm wrong when it's on your tea table." Harriet fled to the parlor before. She said something she'd regret. She sat in the wing-back chair by the fire, the mending basket in her lap, and picked at a hem she'd already stitched twice. It was silly, really. She'd only known Arthur a fortnight, and most of that had been spent discussing broken floorboards and window panes. But he had a way of speaking plainly without being unkind, and when he smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkled, like he'd seen enough of life to earn the right. She supposed she missed him. Quietly so, when the letter came. She saw it before the postmistress did. She'd walked to the shop that morning, under a pale sun, basket in hand for bread and soap. Mrs. Talbot, at the post counter, was sorting a new bundle, her thick spectacles catching the light. Harriet barely noticed the newsprint or the advertisements. Her eyes went straight to the cream envelope marked in a square. "Careful hand, Miss Harriet. Fenn the Parsonage, Westgate Hollow." Yorkshire. Her fingers tingled slightly as she took it. Back at the house, she tucked herself into her chair and opened the envelope with the quiet reverence of a reader unsealing the first page of a long-awaited book. "Dear Miss Fenn, I hope this letter finds you well, and that the repairs to your schoolhouse remain undisturbed by the local weather or the occasional mischievous squirrel. Hall is damp and grey and far too noisy. I find myself missing the rhythm of Westgate Hollow, the way the bell sounds different in the morning than it does at dusk, and the way tea always tastes slightly better when someone else brews it. Thank you again for your kindness while I was visiting. I confess, I hadn't expected to enjoy the work so much. It's not often that restoration feels more like a beginning than a repair. If you'll allow it, I'd like to write again. Yours sincerely, Arthur Redwell Harriet. Read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it between the pages of her book of Wordsworth. She didn't smile, not right away, but her eyes lingered on the window pane, where a single drop of rain chased its reflection down the glass. She wrote back that evening, after the lamps were lit and Samuel had gone to bed. Dear Mr. Redwell, your letter arrived with the sun, a rare coincidence in March. We're all well, and the schoolhouse remains in one piece, though a few local squirrels may take issue with your comment. I suspect they've formed a union. Your description of Hall made me grateful for muddy boots and all. The bell has indeed changed its voice this week, though I'd never thought to notice until you mentioned it. Please do write again. Yours, Harriet. Fenchy sealed the envelope and handed it to the postboy the next morning, trying not to watch too eagerly as he tucked it under his arm and disappeared down the lane. Weeks passed, and spring crept in on velvet feet. Crocuses poked shyly through the frost, and the hedge outside the parsonage grew restless with sparrows. The village stirred, as it always did with the turn of seasons, shaking off winter like an old coat, and the letters continued. Arthur wrote every week, sometimes twice. He described his projects: a bakery in Bridlington, a widow's porch in Gouland, always found a way to ask after Samuel, the parsonage garden, and Mrs. Gowling's biscuits. Harriet wrote back with news of parish births and funeral sermons, weather reports, and the antics of Mr. Marsh's goat. But in between, something else threaded itself through the Inca tone, a warmth, a rhythm, all their own. They were not love letters, not quite, but they felt like they belonged in the same family. One evening, after receiving his fourth letter, Harriet stood in the parlor and caught herself smiling into her teacup. The fire cracked softly, and the wind outside had turned to a low, familiar moan. Mrs. Gowling passed by the door, muttering to herself, "That Lascelles be for something yet." Harriet didn't answer, but she did turn the page of her book and let the thought settle like a bookmark between heartbeats. The sun broke early over Westgate Hollow that April morning, cutting a wide arc across the valley and flooding the parsonage parlor with golden light. Birds, mostly finches, and the occasional bold robin gossiped noisily from the hedgerows, and for the first time in many months, the windows of the old church schoolhouse stood open to the breeze. Harriet Fenn smoothed a stack of copybooks and laid them out on the broad wooden table that served as her desk. The scent of chalk and beeswax mingled with the fresh air, and every now and again a gust would ruffle the corner of her skirt or nudge the inkwell, as if the room itself were restless for company. Arthur Redwell was due to arrive within the hour. It had been 6 weeks since his last letter, his longest silence yet. The final note had come with apologies. A commission in Sheffield had kept him longer than expected. Too much dust and too little tea, he had written. But the porch is sound, and the widow smiles again. Now he was coming back. Not forever, Harriet reminded herself. Just for the final restoration, 3 weeks, perhaps 4. Still, the prospect sent a quiet thrill up her spine, which she sternly tamped down with arithmetic exercises and the opening. Him scheduled by the time the cart arrived at the parsonage gate. She'd already laid out fresh linen in the spare room and sent Samuel off to collect more ink from the post office. Mrs. Gowling had taken one look at the fruitcake Harriet attempted and declared it not fit for feeding the crows, then busied herself baking something more suitable. Harriet was halfway through brushing chalk from her skirt when she heard the wheels. He stepped down from the cart with his hat in hand and boots still dusty from the road. The same crooked smile tugged at his mouth, and he looked so thoroughly familiar that she was taken aback by how long it had truly been. "Miss Fenn," he said, his voice warm. "Mr. Redwell," she replied, smoothing her skirts unnecessarily. "You're early." He looked past her shoulder to the open schoolhouse windows. "Couldn't wait to see what damage the squirrels have done in my absence." She laughed, despite herself. They've unionized. I'm afraid your tools may have be held hostage. He chuckled, and followed her toward the schoolhouse, the old gate creaking in protest as they passed. The morning passed quickly. Arthur worked with sleeves rolled to the elbows, sawdust haloing his boots as he repaired the last of the window frames. Harriet, sitting at her desk nearby, corrected spelling errors and drafted next week's lesson on Chaucer. Now and again, their eyes would meet across the room, and for a moment, the work paused not long, just a beat, like the brief hush between birdsong at noon. Mrs. Gowling brought a tray of sandwiches and tea. She raised a knowing eyebrow at Harriet as she set it down, but said nothing, retreating with a smirk. Your housekeeper terrifies me, Arthur admitted as he reached for a sandwich. She's part vulture, Harriet agreed, but a very loyal one. He bit into his sandwich, then gestured toward the open door. Care for a walk? She hesitated, then nodded. Let me fetch my shawl. They walked the hedgerow path behind the church, where the grass grew wild and the first bluebells nodded beneath the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and new life, and far above, a skylark cut spirals through the sky, its song sharp and sweet, so Arthur said, as they crossed the low stile near the sheep-fields. I've a question that's been bothering me for weeks. Only one, he grinned. For now. She looked at him sidelong. Go on then, why Wordsworth? He asked. Your copy same one you kept my first letter in, if I'm not mistaken. I saw it on your shelf. Harriet blinked, surprised. You remember that? Course. I do. She considered for a moment, then shrugged. My mother used to read it aloud when I was small. Daffodils and lake winds and all that. I suppose I associate it with feeling safe. He nodded, thoughtfully. That's a good reason. We all need a few words that feel like shelter. They paused at the edge of the field. In the distance, the school bell rang one Samuel's doing, no doubt, showing off. Arthur turned to her, suddenly serious. There's another reason I came back early. Harriet stiffened slightly. Oh. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I've been offered a long-term post in York, a museum commission. Restoration and preservation, mostly. Nothing too glamorous. She took the letter and read quickly. The offer was respectable. Pay sufficient. Duration indefinite. I'd have to relocate, he said gently. And soon. She looked up. But you've only just returned. I know. Then why tell me this now? He hesitated. Because whether I take it or not depends on something else. Her throat tightened. I'm not sure I understand. Arthur took a breath. Would you consider coming to York? Not immediately, not even this year, perhaps. But eventually, when you're ready. The words settled into the silence, like a soft boot print in snow. Not demanding, not rushing, just present, waiting. Harriet's heart thudded, quiet but steady. I love my work here, she said softly. I know, and my father, Samuel, Mrs. Gowling. The school, I'm not asking you to leave it all, he said quickly, only to think about what might come next. Together, Harriet folded the letter and held it tightly in both hands. I'll need time. You've got it, Arthur said, his voice gentle. They walked back slowly, each step a little more deliberate than the one before. By the time the schoolhouse came into view, the sky had softened, clouds parting to let shafts of light fall. On the flagstones, the village lay quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or clatter of a kettle in a back kitchen. From the window, Samuel watched them approach, his eyes squinting suspiciously through the glass. That night, Harriet sat in the parlor with the lamplight low and a letter spread before her. Her pen hovered, then touched the page. Dear Mr. Redwell, I would very much like to see the York Museum someday, but not for its exhibits. Yours, Harriet, she smiled. And in the quiet of the evening, with the fire whispering in the hearth and the moon rising gently over Westgate Hollow, she thought perhaps this letter belonged tucked into Wordsworth, between lines written in early spring, and she was a phantom of delight. The summer of 1905 settled over Westgate Hollow with a thick, golden certainty. Mornings began early, with the call of the blackbirds and the hum of bees over open lavender. By noon, the sun scorched the slate rooftops and shimmered on the church's stained glass windows. The scent of warm hay drifted in from the meadows, and even the most talkative villagers seemed to move and speak a little slower, lulled by the heat. At the parsonage, the days followed their usual rhythm bells and chalk, dust, laundry on the line, sermons prepared on the back porch, while the bees worked the hollyhocks. But a change had settled there too, subtle as the new shoots of a rosebush. A letter tucked in a drawer, a look exchanged between shared teacups, the lingering echo of laughter in the hallway. Arthur Redwell remained in Westgate Hollow longer than planned. The museum in York had sent a follow-up offer, kinder and more generous than the first, but he had written back asking for a postponement. There are still loose ends, he'd told them. A schoolhouse window here, a summer sermon bench there. But Harriet knew what he truly meant. And she hadn't asked him to stay, but she hadn't asked him to leave either. On the morning of St. Swithin's Day, Harriet rose early and found the sky streaked with white gold clouds. The forecast had promised rain, but the day began with such promise it felt like a blessing. She made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Gowling was already stoking the stove. "You're humming," the older woman observed, without looking up from her teapot. "I am not." "You are." "Been doing it since midsummer." Harriet poured herself a cup of tea and didn't argue. Instead, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the garden breathe beneath the rising sun. The roses Arthur had helped prune in March were now a riot of color: deep scarlet, pale cream, and a pink so tender it might have been drawn from a child's cheek. "Arthur says the schoolhouse is nearly finished," she said aloud. Mrs. Gull gave a knowing grunt. "Aye, and what's he going to do when it is?" "I don't know," Harriet said honestly. "You do," the old woman said, softly. "You've known since spring." Harriet didn't reply. Later that morning, Samuel marched into the parlor with his boots muddy and his hair askew. "I saw Mr. Redwell down by the churchyard," he announced. "He's building a bench." "A bench? For sitting, I expect." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you so certain?" "He said so. Then he gave me a toffee. And he says I hammer like a proper apprentice." Mrs. Gowling snorted. "Aye, the boy'll be building a bell tower by next Tuesday." Harriet excused herself after lunch, claiming errands in the village. She walked slowly past the bakery, where the scent of warm currants teased the air, and then along the hedgerow path that curved around the back of the church. There he was, Arthur, seated on a half-finished bench beneath the old beech tree that watched over the gravestones. He wore his sleeves rolled and his cap tilted back on his brow, and he looked up at her with the familiar, easy smile she'd come to recognize, like her own reflection. "Come to inspect the craftsmanship?" he asked. "I came for the toffee," she replied, sitting beside him. He handed her a sweet from his coat pocket, slightly melted from the sun. They sat in silence for a moment, the breeze stirring the long grasses around them, the church bell echoing faintly from down the hill. "I used to sit here with my mother," Harriet said quietly, looking at the view. "After lessons, she'd pack tea in a jar, and we'd split a plum cake." "Sounds like a fine tradition." It was. Until she passed. "I stopped coming here after." Arthur nodded, understanding without pressing. Maybe it's time the bench saw some use again. They sat there a while, watching the clouds stretch like linen across the sky. A pair of jackdaws cawed lazily from the tower, and someone somewhere was hammering fence posts into dry earth. Eventually, Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "I've accepted York," he said simply. Harriet felt her breath catch, though she knew it had been coming. "When? September?" She nodded. "That's not far off." "No." She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she traced her fingertip along the grain of the wood beneath her hand. "You'll be good at it," she said softly. "I hope so." They sat for a while longer, the silence full of words neither of them knew how to say. Then, finally, he spoke again. "But I don't plan to go alone." She looked up, startled. "I'd like to court you properly, Harriet," he said. "And if one day you'd come to York, well, I'd make sure there's room enough for your books, and your garden, and Samuel's endless questions." She laughed a sudden, surprised laugh that spilled into the air like a sparrow taking flight. "And Mrs. Gowling," she asked, "she can run the kitchen and scare the neighbors. I'd be honored." She turned toward him then, fully. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." They stood and walked back to the parsonage together, side by side, their shadows long on the grass behind them. The village lay drowsy in the late sun, the scent of hay and roses curling through the hedges, and somewhere far above, a skylark rose on the breeze. Later, at supper, Samuel announced that he would build the new pulpit by hand if Arthur left him the right nails. Mrs. Gowling, without comment, served them the fruitcake she'd deemed unfit for the crows 3 months earlier. "It's sweet now," Harriet remarked. "Aye," said the old woman. "A bit of time and warmth does wonders." The morning Arthur Redwell left Westgate Hollow, the skies turned cool, and the wind rolled in low across the fens. A light mist had settled on the hedgerows, and the scent of wood smoke lingered as the first hearths were lit for autumn. Leaves hung limp and still on the trees, not yet ready to fall, but braced for the change to come. Harriet Fenn stood beside the gate as Arthur climbed into the cart, his case beside him, his cap in his hands. Behind her, the parsonage sat neat and quiet, the windows closed. The rosebush now tipped with hips instead of blooms. "I'll write the moment I arrive," he said. "You'd better," she replied, her voice steady. The driver clucked to the horse, and the cart lurched forward. Arthur turned to look back at her until the lane curved and the trees swallowed him. Harriet didn't wave. She simply stood until the last echo of wheels faded, then turned and walked back inside. That afternoon, she moved slowly through the rooms of the parsonage, straightening books, checking the pantry, making notes in the school ledger. She paused at the bench under the beech tree, now finished and sanded smooth, and sat there with her arms folded, the hem of her skirt brushing the carved initials, AR+HF, carved with Samuel's penknife, during a stolen moment just before LAMMAS. By evening, the mist returned, thick with the smell of harvest fires. Mrs. Gowling watched her carefully through supper. Samuel, now officially 10 years old and terribly grown up, was unusually quiet. "I suppose he'll be painting all them Roman things now," the boy muttered, poking at his stew. "He restores them," Harriet corrected gently. "Cleans and preserves them so others can see their beauty." "Still sounds dull," he grumbled, though she saw his eyes flick toward the empty place at the table. The first letter arrived 4 days later, addressed in Arthur's slanted hand. "My dear Miss Fenn, the train was late, the porter gruff, and my landlady suspicious of carpenters. But I am here, and the windows in my rooms face west. I've found a bakery that serves hot buns at dawn, and I think of you each morning as I walk past the bell tower on Lendal Bridge. The museum is an odd place, quiet, but full of ghosts. I've begun work on the bust of Antinous, whose nose I suspect was broken more by carelessness than antiquity. I miss the beech tree, and your tea, and the way your eyebrows twitch when you're trying not to laugh. Yours faithfully and fondly." Arthur Archie read it twice, then tucked it into the drawer beside her bed. More letters followed, some long and descriptive, full of museum gossip and York's eccentric personalities. Others brief, just a note about the rain, or a poem scribbled in the margin, or a question about Samuel's latest invention, a periscope made from mirrors and a soup tin. In return, Harriet wrote back regularly. She described her school lessons, the harvest festival planning, a strange new board game the vicar's wife insisted upon, and the apples beginning to drop from the tree behind the shed. She included drawings, nothing elaborate, just ink sketches of the rose hips or the twisted chimney pot Samuel claimed housed a ghost. Each letter was carefully wrapped and posted every Thursday morning, and each arrival from York was marked with a smile and the ceremonial slicing of the envelope with her old letter opener, the one shaped like a feather. September melted into October. The parsonage changed with the season. Curtains were drawn earlier. The evenings grew longer, filled with firelight and the soft shuffle of slippers on floorboards. The garden curled inward, retreating under fallen leaves and the scent of damp soil. One Wednesday morning, Harriet received a letter that bore no return address, just her name in Arthur's hand. My dearest H, you once said you wanted to know what came next, that you weren't ready to answer in summer, when the roses were still open and we sat on the bench beneath the beech tree. But the leaves are falling now, so I ask again, as simply as I can, will you marry me? Not in haste. Not before you're ready, but when the term is done, or next spring, or whenever you would like. There is a small house in Bootham Row. The roof leaks in the back room, and the windows are stubborn, but it's quiet and close to the museum. It has a garden that could hold every one of your roses. I have a place for Samuel's books, and a spot where Mrs. Gowling can hang her apron. Say yes, and I'll wait for the wedding. Say no, and I'll wait for your next letter. Yours, always, Arthur. She read it at the breakfast table, her tea growing cold beside her. Samuel looked up at her, curious. Bad news? He asked. She shook her head slowly. The opposite. Mrs. Gowling, wiping her hands on her apron, narrowed her eyes. That man's finally proposed, hasn't he? Harriet blinked. How did you, please? I could see it in his handwriting since July. Samuel brightened. We're moving to York. Harriet looked around the kitchen, the walls she had grown up within. The little pewter hooks by the stove where her mother's shawl once hung. The parlor where her father had read aloud from the Book of Psalms. The garden gate that creaked only when someone special leaned on it, just so. Yes, she said softly. I think we are. Samuel cheered. Mrs. Gowling muttered something about finally seeing a city again that wasn't all sheep and dust. Harriet just sat a little longer, watching the firelight flicker in the hearth. She didn't write her reply immediately. She waited a week, not out of doubt, but out of reverence for the life she'd lived here, for the church bells and the hedgerow paths, for every letter that had brought them to this place. When she did write, she kept it simple. Dear Arthur, yes, yours. Harriet tanned. Then she walked out to the beech tree bench and tied the letter with twine. Samuel offered to deliver it to the post himself, and off he ran down the lane, the letter swinging from his hand. A grin stretched wide across his face. Autumn crept in quietly, carrying with it the last warmth of summer and the first promise of something new. The days shortened quickly after Harriet posted her letter. Westgate Hollow settled into the hush of late autumn cobblestones, slick with rain. Fields stripped bare, and smoke curling from chimney pots like quiet handwriting against the gray sky. Inside the parsonage, the mood was neither sad nor celebratory, but gentle, as if the old house, long used to comings and goings, understood that some goodbyes were not endings but the turn of a page. Harriet spent her mornings teaching, and her afternoons sorting through papers. There were drawers full of dried ink bottles, notes from long-forgotten sermons, pressed ferns, recipes in her mother's hand. Every object felt like a farewell, but also an offering pieces of a life she had lived fully, and now passed gently into memory. Do we really need to take the candlesticks? Mrs. Gowling grumbled one morning, packing a box with more determination than delicacy. They were my mother's, Harriet replied, adding a cloth to cushion them. Then they'll come, the older woman muttered. Samuel was more excited than anyone. He had begun referring to York as the city with capital letters, and had drawn a detailed map of the railway journey, complete with dragons and toll bridges. Each evening, he peppered them with questions. Would the new house have a cellar? Would Arthur let him polish artifacts? Could he keep chickens? I doubt there's a coop in Bootham Row, Harriet told him. I'll build one, he said with confidence. Arthur's letters arrived faithfully, now laced with the urgency of someone preparing for a new chapter. He'd mended the back roof, cleared out the garden, and cleansed the worst of the leaky plumbing in the washroom. His latest note came with a pressed sprig of rosemary tucked inside. For remembrance, he'd written beneath it, and perhaps for seasoning. The landlord insists the oven is finally working. It was strange, Harriet thought, how quickly her heart had come to rest in a place she had never yet seen. On the last Sunday of November, she gave her farewell sermon in the village church. The pews were full. Mrs. Bramble in her mauve shawl, the carpenter's twins with polished boots, the postmistress dabbing her eyes. Even Mr. Alden, who hadn't set foot in the chapel since Queen Victoria died, sat stiffly in the back row. Harriet wore her simplest dress and no hat. She spoke gently, without flourish or tears. "Home," she said at the end, "is not only where we begin, it is also what we carry forward. In love, in memory, and in kindness. Westgate Hollow has shaped me as surely as the stones of this church were shaped by the mason's hand. I will not forget." When she stepped down from the pulpit, the room was quiet. Then someone clapped softly at first, then others joined. Not raucous, but full of warmth. A village sang thank you. Outside, the wind rattled the yew branches. Winter was on its way. The final week passed in a blur of packing and visitors. People came by with pies, plum preserves, knitted scarves. "And one very puzzled hen, she follows your boy everywhere," explained Mr. Hemstock. Harriet accepted them all with grace. On the last evening before the journey to York, she stood once more beneath the beech tree bench. The sky had turned amber and smoke blue, and a single robin piped a lonely tune from the churchyard wall. Mrs. Gowling stepped out beside her, a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. "I never thought I'd leave this place," the old woman said. "Nor did I, and yet," Harriet echoed. The next morning the cart arrived just after dawn. They loaded the final trunks, wrapped the fragile things in quilts, and checked every corner of the house twice. Samuel hugged the banister goodbye. "I'll miss you." "Stair," he said solemnly. "You'll find new stairs to befriend," Harriet assured him. As they rolled out of Westgate Hollow, the mist began to lift. People waved from garden gates and shop doors. Children chased the cart for a few steps. Someone tossed a small bouquet into Harriet's lap ivy and rosehip, tied with twine. And just like that, the hollow faded behind them. The train journey to York was uneventful, but full of quiet excitement. The countryside blurred past sheep. In the fields, rows of dark hedges, stone walls like lines of ancient verse. Samuel leaned out the window until soot blackened his nose. Then, finally, York had unfolded before them in slate and smoke, towers and spires. They passed the minster, whose bells rang out as if welcoming them. The streets bustled with carts and the smell of roasting chestnuts. Arthur was waiting on the platform. He wore his best coat and a woolen scarf. His face, half hidden beneath his cap, lit up when he saw them. He tipped his hat at Harriet, then held out his hand. She took it without hesitation. "Welcome home," he said. The house on Bootham Row was small, but warm. 2 stories, crooked. Windows, ivy along the wall. Inside, the fire had already been lit, and the scent of rosemary and coal mingled in the air. "This is the kitchen," Arthur said, leading them inside. "And that's the back room, still leaks, mind you, but I've made it respectable." He showed them the garden bare for now, but with a plot ready for spring planting. He showed Samuel the attic, which would be his domain. He showed Harriet the parlor window, where the morning light streamed in just so. "It isn't Westgate Hollow," he said quietly, "but it's ours." She looked out the window, then back at him. "Yes," she said, "it is." And that night, for the first time in months, Harriet slept without dreaming of the past. Outside, the bells of York tolled gently. Inside, the fire crackled, and the walls seemed to exhale in welcome. The next morning, she found a letter on the kitchen table. Not one written in Arthur's hand, nor her own. It was addressed simply, "From the Hollow." And when she opened it, she smiled. The letter from Westgate Hollow was penned in blue ink on paper that smelled faintly of lavender and coal smoke. It came from Miss Tabitha Finch, the retired midwife who had once lived beside the chapel. Harriet read it twice, smiling gently, as she traced each line. "My dear Harriet, the Hollow feels your absence. The chapel windows are too clean without your hand to smudge them with wax during morning lessons. And the school children now pass their sums to Mrs. Bramble, who marks them with an iron fist. Mr. Alden has taken to quoting you, oddly enough, when discussing rainfall and ethics. The geese remain ungovernable. Enclosed, you'll find a sprig of sage from your mother's herb patch. It's thriving though, a bit wild, much like Samuel. We miss you. Visit when the frost has lifted. Yours in friendship and foolishness, T." Finch. Harriet folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside the cupboard beside her tea tins. Then she opened the back door and stepped into the Bootham Row garden. It was early morning. York was beginning to rouse. The milk cart clattered along the lane, and the faint chiming of the minster's bells filtered through the air. Cold mist curled over the cobblestones, and smoke puffed lazily from their own chimney. She crouched and buried the sage sprig in the freshly turned soil beside the kitchen wall, whispering a blessing out of habit. When she stood, Arthur was watching her from the doorway, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "Another ghost planted?" he asked, handing her one. "More like a friend." They sipped in silence for a while, watching the faint gold of the sun touch the rooftops. Samuel stumbled down the stairs minutes later, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He wore his trousers backwards and one sock inside out. "There's a cat in the alley," he announced. "It's missing half an ear and tried to eat my breakfast." "That would be Marmalade," Arthur said. "She belongs to the butcher's wife. Feed her once, and she's yours forever." "I like her," Samuel said, then added, "She looks like she'd fight ghosts." As the days passed, the rhythm of life in York took hold. Harriet took up part-time work cataloging the museum's small collection of medieval prayer books, using her neat script and reverent care to bring order to the pages. Arthur spent long hours restoring Roman mosaics and oiling cracked sculptures. His workbench was always dusty, his shirts flecked with gold and ochre. Samuel enrolled in the local schooler, sturdy stone building, with thin windows and strict teachers. His first week ended with a scraped elbow and an enthusiastic drawing of a trebuchet. On Saturdays, they visited the shambles for bread and plums. On Sundays, they strolled the walls or wandered the gardens of the treasurer's house. Life was not grand, but it was good, filled with laughter, muddy boots, and the kind of joy that grows slowly but surely, like ivy along a fence post. On early February, Harriet returned home with a letter from her old vicar. She read it at the kitchen table, while Samuel practiced handwriting nearby, carefully looping his K's, as if each one might earn him a coin. "What is it?" Arthur asked. "They want me to speak at the spring vesper gathering in Westgate Hollow," she said. "Just a short reading and a blessing." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Will you go?" "I think I must," she said. "It's been nearly 3 months. I feel like I've left something unfinished." Samuel perked up. "Can we come, too?" Arthur chuckled. "You just want to see the chickens." But they agreed to go. When March arrived, they boarded the train with one small case, a basket of scones for Mrs. Galling's sister, and a roll of drawings Samuel insisted on delivering to the village schoolmaster because his maps are boring. Westgate Hollow met them with grey skies and the scent of peat smoke. The fields were still half frozen, and puddles reflected a thin, watery light. The chapel bells chimed as they stepped onto the platform. It felt like stepping into a memory. They stayed with Miss Finch, who had prepared the guest room with stiff linen and a jar of quince jam. The house was unchanged, sloping floors, a leaky stove, and a large cat named Rufus, who refused to share the hearth rug. The vesper service was simple and soft-spoken. Villagers gathered with shawls and mittens, and candles flickered along the pews. When Harriet stood to speak, her voice didn't tremble. "I once thought that leaving home was an ending," she said. "But home is not made only of bricks or timetables. It is made of kindness, memory, and the courage to build something new." When she stepped down, Mrs. Bramble wept quietly into her gloves. Mr. Hemstock offered a rather muddy bouquet. Samuel was hugged until his coat smelled of lavender and old sugar that night, as the wind shook the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth. Harriet sat beside Arthur on the old beech tree bench. The carving was still there, AR+H now, but legible. "You never told me what you thought the F stood for," she said. "I always hoped it was for forever," Arthur replied, his voice low. She leaned her head against his shoulder, smiling. And there, in the fading light of a Westgate evening, their story continued to bloom. Spring came early to Bootham Row in March. Crocuses burst like little purple flames beneath the hedgerow, and the days stretched out, golden at the edges. York, once grey and shivering, began to soften. Market stalls filled with daffodils and new potatoes. A street fiddler returned to the square near the minster, his tune bright as sunlight skipping across puddles. For Harriet, life unfolded gently now. There were no more abrupt endings, no long nights filled with letters and hesitation. Each morning she rose early, tied her apron, and pressed tea leaves into the pot with a steady hand. The kettle whistled, and the sun crept through the parlor window, tracing patterns on the floor like lace. The garden behind the house bloomed slowly. The sage from Westgate Hollow survived the frost and sent out tender new leaves. A handful of snowdrops pushed through by the fence. Samuel planted carrots in a neat row and named each one after a character in Ivanhoe. Arthur fixed the shed roof, with more confidence than skill, and taught himself to whistle again. Badly, Harriet teased him one evening. Faith and practice, he said. Give it 10 more years. Sundays were for walking, sometimes through the museum gardens, where Roman pillars leaned like thoughtful old men, or along the river Ouse, its current strong but steady. Once, they walked all the way to Bishop, where swans drifted lazily on the shallows, and Samuel insisted he saw a mermaid. In late April, Harriet received a parcel. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the paper smelled like wood smoke and beeswax. Inside was a stitched sampler, a circle of herb sage, rosemary, thyme, and at the center, a tiny house with smoke curling up from its chimney. Below, a phrase in delicate thread: for the hearth you built, and the home you carry, no signature. But Harriet knew it was from one of her pupils back in the hollow. She pinned it beside the window, where the sunlight touched it each morning. Arthur's work began to attract notice. The museum director invited him to give a lecture on intimate conservation techniques of ecclesiastical stonework, which, he claimed, sounded more scandalous than it was. Harriet laughed so hard, she spilled ink on the table. Samuel won a prize for a drawing of Roman chariots and asked if he could sell copies to raise money for a printing press. He had grand plans to publish his own history of Britain, beginning with the invention of the sock. One afternoon in early May, a small group gathered in the parlor. Harriet had begun teaching again, not a formal school, but a few local children, brought by friends and neighbors who remembered her gentle way of explaining Latin roots and the poetry of herbs. She wrote lessons on brown paper, baked shortbread for the children, and taught them the word for light in 7 languages. They left with crumbs in their collars and their eyes full of ideas. When the children left, Harriet often sat by the window. She watched the clouds roll over the rooftops and sometimes thought about the hollow, its bramble edges and bee loud summer days, the church bells, and the muddy road that led to the parsonage. But the ache was gone. The past was still there, as present as the threads in the sampler, but no longer holding her back. "Do you miss it?" Arthur asked one night, as they folded laundry by the fire. "Yes," she said simply. "But missing is part of loving, and I have new things to love now." She hung a towel by the hearth. It smelled of lavender and ashdot that summer. Harriet's name was included in a small exhibition on women educators in Yorkshire. A single cabinet held some of her students' letters, a pressed sprig of rue, and one of her hand-drawn diagrams of monastic herb gardens. She attended the opening in a simple dress and stood quietly beside her display. Arthur squeezed her hand. Samuel ran off to find the Roman skull in the museum's basement vault. When the exhibition closed, they let her take the herbs and letters home. Time passed as it always does unnoticed. Then, all at once, by autumn, the garden had turned again. Apples fell heavily in Bootham Row, and chimney smoke returned to the rooftops. Samuel outgrew another pair of boots. Harriet mended the hems and turned the pages of her books more slowly. In November, a letter arrived from the Hollow. Miss Finch had passed away peacefully in her sleep, beneath her patchwork quilt and a pile of library books. The funeral would be held at the chapel. They traveled back together. The road was familiar now, but quieter. They were met by Mrs. Bramble, who had not changed a bit, and young Tom Hemstock, now a strapping apprentice with ink-stained fingers. Harriet spoke at the service. Not a sermon, but a recollection. Tabitha believed that every woman should learn to make a fire and stitch a wound, she said. She taught me both. She taught many of us more than we realized. They buried her beside the apple tree in the chapel yard. Harriet laid rosemary on the soil. Samuel asked if they could visit her each year, every year. Harriet promised. That night, they stayed in the parsonage guest room. The house smelled the same. The floorboards creaked in the same spots. But it no longer felt like something she needed to hold on to. She sat at the parlor window once more, just for a moment. Snow was falling softly, dusting the empty road. She imagined the children in their beds, the bakery shutters drawn, the lamplighter making his final rounds, the village, at peace. She whispered a thank you and closed the curtain. In York, life resumed with no grand conclusion. Just warmth, laughter, and the slow turning of seasons. One morning, Samuel found a hedgehog curled beneath the rosemary bush. They built it a house of bricks and leaves, and called it Rufus too, and Harriet, who had once peered through a window and wondered about her place in the world, now stood in the light of her own home, her own garden, her own days, and no longer wondered. She simply lived.